All right, so from the last video, I actually redrew the guy. I was missing a little something, so tried to give him a little give the Kappa a little character. And so here I am going into um, I guess a finished kind of painting. And at the end of this, it's not finished by any means. There's always you always find something else wrong. So let's just call this done for now, but still, I'm probably going to go back and touch some of this up compositionally. I think in the end, I'm pretty happy with the way the materials turned out, but yeah, composition leaves something to be desired. So what you see me doing is I'm painting over the rough and the line, and so this is usually how I'll start. I'll pick like a kind of like when you're doing a study, you pick the easiest color. I'm just picking an area where I don't have to work around a lot of stuff, and I can figure out basically what I'm doing. Uh, and so you'll see me switch back and forth between a soft round brush or a round brush and a bristle kind of brush, and I'm just trying to get different edges. In the end, the painting gets it gets tight to the point where it doesn't really you don't even see the brush strokes anymore, but it's just for variety's sake. And so this goes back to all I'm doing now is like this is just 90%. I mean, this is the last 5% of the painting, but it takes the longest, maybe 10% of the painting. And this is just rendering of the details. So again, this wasn't like one shot go. This was I did this once and then I had to scrap what I had and I started over again. So this is the second attempt. Um, so yeah, I'm just alternating between brushes, you'll see me switch to the smudge tool because that's a really easy way to kind of get just a nice, I guess, variety of edges. And it also indicates some surface texture. And so right now I'm just kind of blocking in the forms, going back to, the first couple classes where it was, fill light, bounce light, or key light, fill light, cast shadows, and form shadows. And really that's all I'm doing right now. And you'll see me do that a lot, click layers off and on to see, if I'm actually progressing or if I'm kind of just spinning my wheels. Um, I'm kind of designing this guy on the fly. Not so much anymore, but I'm not completely sure how all the pieces fit together. So usually when I'm working, I'll have a character design from somebody else, especially if it's like a hero piece like this, where the central focus of the image is the character. Usually the character's been figured out. So um, I'm not sure how certain joints work. I'm not sure of his proportions, but for what it is, well, it is what it is. um, so yeah, kind of you'll see me do this quite a bit. I've edited this heavily because it's about 7 hours condensed into an hour and 10. So um, yeah, I this is just to show you that, at least I don't get it right out of the gate. I know there's amazing people that do, but yeah, I kind of started that skull and I actually started it I think a second time and got rid of it, and and you would have been none the wiser had I not said anything. So again, what I'm doing is I go in and painting with either the round brush or a bristly brush. I'm painting in, the shadows and I'm working the transition. So I get the value and I get the color, and then I work the transition. And so we're jumping into the underside of the neck right now. And I didn't have this in the drawing, so I was trying to figure this out. I was looking at some reference of alligator turtles. Um, and they kind of have these cool wrinkles around their neck because their head retracts back into their shell. So I tried to add a little bit of that. How plausible is it? Don't really care at this point. I'm just trying to get something that looks cool and would get somebody excited. Um, and that's kind of what these pieces are basically for. I mean, aside from informing look, I mean texturing, modeling, lighting, you're also just trying to get people excited. So these types of paintings don't necessarily, at least in my experience, happen too often. Either they happen at the very beginning or every once in a while in the middle of production, they'll say, hey, we want you to figure out, we want a really nice painting of this. And usually it has a double usage for marketing or something else. So now you see me, I paint in a value or paint in a color and then I'm reworking the edges. I mean, that's really all this is like you're just smushing around digital paint. You're refining edges, and really there's not much, I guess, overall technique to it. It's just kind of putting, eh, you guys have kind of learned the basics already. I mean, and now it's just kind of, pushing around those points, pushing around that paint. You're picking your colors accurately, so now you just have to work on the edges. So what I'm going to do here is I want like this nice kind of like ambient occlusion shadow. Well, it'll be coming up in a second, but I want this nice shadow, and I don't want to stay limited, um, I guess, to, I don't want to parent or start being dependent on layers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new layer, um, hopefully soon. I'm still kind of going in and yeah, I constantly, when I'm painting, I'm constantly going back and forth to areas that I think I can get right pretty quick. And it's all about comparison. So you can keep comparing one piece to another. So I think, yeah, here we go. So what I do is I airbrush in the dark area and then I put a mask on and I can paint um, a nice edge. So what this allows me to do is get a really soft edge with a crisp edge on one side, and I don't have to mess around a lot um, with being careful about the stroke. I paint in like a broad airbrush, and then I just mask it out, invert the mask, and then paint back into it. I guess paint what I want to see onto the image. Um, Again, more just detailing. That's all this is detailing, making edges, defining edges. One thing, this is actually something interesting, is I find the more that you can get um, surfaces to believably wrap or layer over one another, um, it's just a subtle thing that people register, and that's kind of what I was doing um, with that little piece of the underarm as it rests on his knee. It just kind of it pops up a little. It's a little thing, and it doesn't make or break a painting, but it is kind of like, I guess, if you want to, it's just a little added bonus. Um, Going in trying to get the idea of the skin. So really, the thinking right now is all about form because I've pretty much got most of the color out of the way. And you'll notice that I painted out the highlights and stuff, and there was some detail on the shoulders that maybe I'll go back in and paint later, but for the purposes of this demo, I felt like this was enough. Um, Save and save often. So kind of just checking if I'm in the ballpark of my initial color rough. Um, just kind of, I think what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to zoom in on the shell and start working on that. And this took me a while, but I knew that I wanted a surface that was, somewhat translucent, or there was subsurface scattering. So, I mean, in reality, I don't believe one of these turtles, this alligator turtle, the shell, I don't think is translucent at all. But this is also a make-believe monster, so we can do what we want. Um, Again, it's more of the same. I paint in blocks of color, and then it's all about manipulating the edges. Um, so what I just did there was there's this neat feature in Photoshop that I didn't know about for a while, which was if you go under Window and under Workspace, I'm sorry, you go down to Arrange, and then it'll say a new window for whatever the file you're working on. So in this case, a new window for Kappa Color underscore 002d.pst. There will be an option for a new window for that. And basically what that does is it creates a duplicate window that you can keep zoomed out, and it'll update all the changes that you make to your initial. So basically you have two instances of the same uh, image open, and you're able to kind of zoom in on one and keep the other kind of zoomed out. So it's basically the navigator, but you can zoom in and out as you want. So continuing with the shell, you see me, I'm using the kind of like a bristly brush. I'm getting more soft edges right now. I want that transition, kind of like we were doing with the with like that hard candy or the gummy surface. It's kind of a cross between the two. It's not as reflective as the hard candy, but it's also, well, I guess it's more like the gummy than anything. But I'm going in and I'm, painting the darker color, and then that little bit of light peeking through, and the trans or the saturated color of the translucency coming through. And I'm kind of just fumbling my way around this. I don't really have a good idea of the forms, but I'll get into trouble if I don't really try and figure it out at this point. So kind of just, I keep looking over at that smaller instance, and I'm seeing what happens, and I'm trying to, avoid repetitive shapes. I mean, they're spikes, but I can have variation within that. Um, I just want it to feel natural. So now I'm going in with a harder brush because I want a definite edge to this. I don't want it to be this super soft, um, spiky shell. I want like a definite top side and an underside with a definite division between the two. And yeah, want some broken up edges. So you see me, again, just putting in the color of what I think is going to be the less translucent part versus the more translucent and the highlight, and I'm kind of just playing with the edges from there. Sometimes I use a smudge tool, sometimes I'm just using the brush. Um, Really, it's kind of up to your discretion. Um, I know, some people don't ever use the smudge tool, and I didn't for a long time, but you know, it, it it's one more type of stroke. Excuse me, it's one more variety of edge. So just kind of clicking that on and off. This part, it was a little tricky because I wanted to just I need to figure out at what point is this really turning away from the light. And you'll see me, I'll go, I'll work in one area and then go back, and I'm kind of just balancing out the image. Again, it's, compare and contrast different things. Does this look right given this? Does this look right given that? And so on. So, I mean, you can see that I don't have a one-to-one for the reference. So I'm looking at that reference and I'm kind of using it loosely. I know that, the spines that come off have like ribs to them, and so I'm kind of hinting at that. Right now, I use the custom brush, which is basically this dot brush that I made, and it's a dual brush with a circle, and so it's just it gives a nice like dappled edge, so it gives the idea of like a rough, uneven surface. Yeah, lots of smudging. But the trick with the smudge tool is, or at least one of the things I like to do is I like to pick an object that has scatter, or a brush that has scatter on it, And it can be any shape you want, but I tend to use it a little more in kind of like a spattering way, because it gives you a nice variety of edge. Whereas if you use the brush on, say, like a regular round brush with no scatter, it just kind of uh, it, it just kind of smushes paint around instead of giving you a nice edge. It just kind of it smears it. Uh, I don't know. It's hard to explain. It's just not as nice of a result. So going back in, so now I'm going to try and resolve the face. Um, a lot of times right now this is a round brush with, well, it was a round brush with like a speckle brush inside, finer dots than the previous one. And sometimes I'll try and, I'll try and use different brushes to get the same effect, which in turn gives you variety. So this is that default chalk brush that comes in Photoshop, and now I'm smudging it with that speckle brush, and now I'm using a round brush. I'm just trying to find um, an edge that I like, a quality to that edge, and searching around for some reference as far as how that mouth should work. Still don't think I got it. Um, it's funny. Usually, at work, I'll usually start with eyes just because it's such a gratifying thing. But I purposely held off because I really hate it when I do a painting or I'm working on a painting and I get something, one part working really well, and I don't want to part with it because, the rest of the painting isn't working well. So it'll be such a small piece that's working, and the rest of the painting would probably benefit if I change that one piece. But I'm so stubborn and I'm so clingy to that one piece that I like that I have a, tough time letting it go. So I left the eyes on purpose, for a while. At least, the rest of his body is fairly figured out and his shell is figured out. So, um, yeah, the mouth was a little confusing. I think I started it several times and kept on moving to other parts of the body. So now I'm gonna, yeah, I think at this point, this was more of a design problem. I didn't know turtles don't have lips. And so I was trying to figure that out. Like, are his teeth on the outside of his mouth, kind of like a crocodile? And or does he have lips? Does he have a beak? And I didn't like the idea of him having a beak, but maybe lips that resembled a beak. So all the more reason to figure out your design early on, especially if you're trying to do a finished kind of piece, like a final frame looking thing. Um, yeah, this was a short-lived idea. It's gonna add some wrinkles, but I mean, it's constantly fighting this, the minute details fixing bigger problems or thinking that they're gonna fix bigger problems. So again, this is typical of me. I'll paint in something, kind of get going, and then I think I get rid of these teeth. Yep, didn't like them. So I'm going to move on to something that I do like. Sometimes if I want to like implement or bring in another color and I want it to blend nicely in, and I don't have a good reference for it, I'll, maybe use a multiply layer and then flatten that layer to my painting and then paint over it. So I wanted a different bit of color around the eyes because in the rough for this one, it just it just popped. It's like he's looking at you, and it's a little area that's slightly different, and so it just becomes kind of like a focal point. So going in, adding some of that fill light. So by now you guys should realize this is actually kind of this is exposed for the shadows. Everything in the light is either just blown out or close to it. Um, so this is actually a lot like I think it was the third week or fourth week where we did materials and that hard candy. I'm putting in kind of like a reflection of the sky. And this is it's so quick to do, but it's so gratifying, and it just makes that eye look super wet. And it's just fun. And just painted in some detail to the eye, the iris or whatever that's, yeah, some aberrations in there. Adding in that little tear duct, and you'd be surprised how much light gets caught on that sometimes. So I'm just trying to play that up, trying to get the edges. Again, this is all about, forms and edges, and I'm just trying to get it to look right. I don't have anything uh, as a a one-to-one reference. I don't have a character design or anything. So continuing on slowly but surely. So I've got a lot of him figured out, and now I'm kind of moving into the smaller details, and I find these harder and harder to do, just because I'm becoming more aware of sometimes repeating things and not having enough variety, and so little things like teeth to make them feel um, just not so repetitive, especially in a creature like this where he's, a little more wild, kind of like, if you look at crocodiles and alligators, they have like this snaggle tooth appearance, and it's, it's partly because of just the almost I know there's not a randomness, but it's kind of a randomness of shapes, the sizes and how they relate to one another. So I'm trying to get that. Um, I think I'll use that technique I did for the throat again, and a technique is a very generous word to use for that, but it really is just you paint in some of the darker areas, and then you can mask it out or erase it out. But just make sure that you do it on a separate layer, and that way I don't have to, I can get a nice transition in the direction I want, and I don't have to worry about, you know, painting back over and keeping that edge crisp on one side and soft on the other. I can just erase back into it. So yeah, this guy's got pretty clean teeth. I think that's one of the things I'd go back and change is probably yellow them up. So here we go with the I'm airbrushing just kind of like an ambient occlusion, kind of a decay of light, and I added a mask, inverted the mask, and now I'm painting back visibility of that airbrushed layer. So that's kind of uh, that helps me in my workflow. Um, I know some guys that just they don't care. They'll just paint it and then paint back over it, and their paintings are awesome. So whatever works for you, really. Um, so so I had this. It just felt weird that his mouth was closed, so I thought it would be cool if there was like a little bit of a snarl. And again, there I go erasing stuff again. Um, trying to, I think at this point I had up on my other monitor some crocodiles, like some reference of crocodiles. And I noticed that they had some divots around the upper part of their teeth, and then some kind of the, a divot at the lower part of the teeth, like kind of like where it popped out. And so this is where I'm kind of struggling with, okay, how does his mouth work? Does he have lips? Are his teeth connected? Does he not have lips? And that's just what you're seeing is basically his jaw. Um, yeah, this is where not having a design, especially in a painting like this, can get you into trouble. If this was like a looser painting and just more about general feel, I wouldn't be worried about this. I certainly wouldn't do a close up of the character. So, but people want to see rendering stuffs, so here it is. Um, Tried to give him a little bit of a snarl. Um, yeah, I'm guessing after the however many weeks it's been, what, 7? This is week 8. The mystery's kind of gone. Like, hopefully you're able to look at this and kind of pick apart what I'm doing, even if you're watching this on mute. Um, which is kind of the goal when you look at other people's paintings. Okay, well they're getting this kind of edge. I mean, how they get that edge, that you might need to ask somebody about, but if you start breaking down, okay, this is a soft edge, this is a hard edge, and this is how this person is lighting this form, and this is what's happening with this color, you can pretty much reverse engineer a lot of paintings. Something about that eye was just not bugging out enough. So remember how they tell you to never zoom in? Yeah, well, sometimes you have to. Again, a majority of paintings that you might end up doing in a production environment won't be this rendered, but this is kind of like, you could have a photo backdrop and, with some of what you've learned, you could pretty much put in a character, a painted character into a photographic background and have it look like it belongs there. I mean, maybe upon, closer inspection, people would kind of say, "Oh, well, yeah, this is a photograph and this is painted." But when they first walk into the room, uh, you'll have them fooled. So I love painting skulls. I don't know what it is. I'm really not a morbid person or anything. I just think that it's just kind of fun. I also like painting monsters, so maybe there's a correlation. So this is typical, like I'll get a certain piece and then I'll look up on reference. And I knew for a skull that I would find some good reference. And I had a decent idea of what the forms were, but I just wanted a refresher. So this is actually a mini example of the whole painting where I'll paint in shapes, graphic shapes that kind of read together, and then I'll play with the edges of those shapes. So some hard edges, some soft edges, and I'm never doing it haphazardly. I'm really thinking, okay, this is a form shadow, so this has a soft edge in this instance. This is a highlight on a rounded surface, so it's going to have a highlight, a strong point, and then it's going to fade off. Um, and really, I mean, it's just kind of, I guess I'm thinking about these, but I'm not thinking about these. Um, Meaning that, after a while you do it and it's just kind of like it's like a language. You're not thinking about the meaning of every word. You're just kind of talking. So, and sometimes, there's some people that speak more effectively. They're very kind of to the point and you get what they're saying. And then there's other people like me that I'll just talk circles and everybody will be confused and be yelling at me for wasting 5 minutes or an hour of their life. So, oh, um, yeah, I originally had the skull without the lower, without the jaw, and I just decided to add it in because I don't have anybody telling me I can't. It's one of the best and worst parts of doing a project or doing a painting for yourself is that no one's telling you what to do, but then again, no one's telling you what to do. No one's telling you when to stop. Um, and so you can just endlessly mess with stuff. I don't want this skull to look like it came from the healthiest of people. I want some missing teeth, some gaps, some unevenness. But again, doing I painted in the ambient occlusion kind of shadow and to the arm. And granted, the skull's not that close to his arm, but it just helps kind of pop the skull off of his arm. And did that just by I created a new layer, painted in like a solid shape of the shadow, and then I just erased out to get the edge I wanted. I think I had way more fun on the skull than anything else. And that really, you know what? That actually brings up a good point. If you if you paint or draw a lot of something that you like, you're gonna, it won't feel like you're spending a lot of time. You'll really enjoy it. And as long as aren't afraid to branch out to other things, you know, that's a great way to kind of keep yourself motivated. Is just, you like painting dragons? Paint some dragons. Painting painting the same thing is better than not painting at all or drawing, either way. So going in, refining the hand. This is actually, I just did this mostly because it's such a small area. This is mostly just the round brush. You might see me kind of use the smudge a little bit, but sometimes I'm a sucker for just painting. Um, for myself, I don't usually do these types of paintings. I like a little more of a, I don't know, a looser feel. But that is personal preference. There's some guys out there that can paint stuff that looks super tight and it has a ton of energy. And I guess that's my biggest, or one of my biggest problems is I tend to lose a lot of energy when I'm tightening up a painting. So always working on that. Again, similar to those shiny materials, his nails are, or his claws are some kind of reflective dark material. So he's catching a little bit of the reflected light, or he's reflecting the sky on those nails. And the edge is fairly sharp on those because that's kind of what happens on really reflective surfaces, shiny surfaces. Um, it's going in. And this is kind of, always try and find a way to explore or to push the idea of form. And, just those little shadows that kind of curve over the surface of the skull from his claws, that just does, it's a little thing, but it just adds another layer of, I guess, explanation. So here, going into the background, and much like when I started with the kappa, I started on his arm, something big and simple. I'm starting with these foreground rocks, mossy rocks, and I have my reference up on my other screen at this point, and yeah, this doesn't go well for a little while. I'm looking at the reference and I'm kind of, trying out colors because again, I don't, I'm thinking warmer, cooler, lighter, darker because it's similar to my reference, but I don't have anything that's exactly like it. And if I were smarter, I'd probably be comping in photos but I mean, that really is, that's a skill set all on its own. Anybody that thinks that just, you know, putting photos into paintings is easy, it is not. Because if you don't do it well, um, it looks bad. But then there's all these guys out there that can, they can paint and they can, you know, add photographic elements into their paintings and, make the transition almost seamless. And that is really, that's something I mean, I'm working on trying to. There's always that, there's a little voice in the back of your, or at least in the back of my head. It's kind of, well, I want to paint everything. I don't want to use photos, but really at the end of the day, it's what gets the job done. And, you always have you always have time to, or you should always have time to paint stuff on your own, to do stuff outside of work, and fulfill your painterly needs there. You can also do it during work. I'm lucky enough that some of my deadlines are, most of my deadlines, for the most part, are sympathetic to me actually painting everything. So, but it's not like that everywhere. So, it doesn't. There's this negative stigma attached to using photographs, and as somebody who tries to paint all their stuff, I don't think twice about, oh, did they use photographs? That's whatever. I don't. If they used photographs and it looks awesome, I don't care. I mean, that's amazing. I wish I could do it. So, so this is just me being completely lost, and at some point I'll wise up and start grabbing some reference or finding some better reference. It's kind of, I go from like micro details to just broad strokes of colors, and I'm not sure what, I'm really confused as to what this shadow area should contain and what the temperature should be. So, I mean, you see a really big discrepancy between that foreground shadow and that midground mound shadow that I'm painting right now. And that's just kind of, that's a no-no. But I'll eventually come around and I'll get something that I'm somewhat okay with. Yeah, for the life of me, I was just having a tough time with this. And usually when you're struggling for something and you have an entire painting to work on, pretty soon I wise up to it and I just move on to another part of the painting. I'll figure something else out and I'll come back to that because I guarantee you that part of the painting will still be there later. And that problem will still have to be solved. It's not going anywhere. So, it's not like I won't get, this is a one-time only deal. I'll have to come back to it eventually. So, yeah, at this point, I think I realized, oh no, I don't think I've ever painted a forest to this degree before. And that's when a little bit of panic set in. But that's good. It motivates you to figure things out. Um, there's a, it's a combination of colors and values and edges that um, make up different elements, and a forest is just another combination of those things. So I say it like it's easy, but it's not. At least for me. Some guys, it's so effortless, and they just sit there and they're not even looking at their screen and they're painting magic. So you can see in the background, I actually started painting some of the trees to the left, um, and I'll eventually get rid of that because sometimes you need to get stuff wrong to get it right. You know, you need to see the worst possible direction you can go in, and then you know correct yourself after that. So, um, kind of getting into the same rut on the other side, and sooner or later, I actually pull up the reference and pick something that'll help me out a little more. So, yeah, this is me being stubborn, and I would not advise it. So, remember how at the beginning I said that I was kind of happy with this painting, but right now I'm actually painting one of the biggest problems that I have with it at the end, which is I have two masses on either side of this painting, and they are the same. They are the same amount of space, almost the same shape, and um, I've just got it, well, obviously not beaten into me well enough, but I'm constantly told that, oh, well, you're mirroring stuff, and that's just something I have to fight with all the time. It's just I guess, my natural tendency to mirror stuff. Um, and I honestly at this point I don't see it. I don't. It, it's not registering, and I'm just painting away. So because I'm so concerned with getting, the detail of this vegetation, that I've lost sight of the rest of the image. And now in retrospect, I could have basically the same shapes there, but have them one receding farther back into space than the other. So they're not on the same plane of depth. And this is me finally grabbing the reference. And I think this is where I start to understand things a little more. And I'm looking at this, and I like the rocks. I like the amount of vegetation. And so I'm going to turn off that background layer that I painted and I hate and is just taunting me every time I look at it. And so now I'm just kind of like, all right, I'm going to start painting stuffs. And, you know, sometimes I get to a point with a painting that, oh, you can see there's the that duplicate window in the arrange. But this way I can see it at a slightly larger size than my navigator, but so there it is. But sometimes I just need to go in and start painting little things. Like I was saying, I sometimes I don't have the patience for just the right brush stroke to eloquently describe a bunch of leaves. Sometimes I have to go in there and just start painting leaves. Maybe I don't paint all of them, but I'm starting to indicate that there's layers of leaves. And if you zoom in on the painting, that's actually pretty loose, but it's just the idea that there's a breakup of shapes and a transition. And again, having never really painted a forest, that'll teach me. To this level, um, I was learning things on the fly. I've painted more jungle areas kind of stuff, but not to this level um, of finish. Um, so one of the things that I started figuring out is that, I get a transition from a lighter side. So using the block in that I used, I get a transition from the lighter to the darker in the shadow, and then I just paint into that. I paint a transition of leaves, um, and it seemed to work okay for this painting. I'm sure you give me a week and I will hate this painting and delete it from my drive because that's just the way it is. You should always, I don't know, you should be really critical of your own artwork. Maybe not to the degree that some people are, but always strive to do a little better. Always strive to have a goal in mind, um, of where you want to be and how you're going to get there. Um, so still completely oblivious to that equal shapes mirroring each other. And really, I this could have been fixed if I just kind of pushed it back in space and maybe broke up that shape just a little more, which is what I might do. Um, but I think for this painting, I need a breather. Tired of looking at this guy. So um, more more foliage. And sometimes this is another thing, and I mean this is an introductory class, and so I apologize if some of this seems obvious, but sometimes I'll use a custom brush, like that dotted brush, and I'll go in to get a randomization of shapes, light and shadow, and then I'll paint back into it. Um, One thing, and this is just me, I don't suggest this for other people. You know, do what you feel comfortable with. But one thing I find is that I don't like really having brushes that I guess you make a stroke and then it's done. Like you don't have to touch it like um, stamping of trees and I just I feel like there's you can always make a different design choice. And maybe that's, it's very possible that that's just a very naive way of thinking. When it comes to production, you just, especially from what I've heard on live action, that it's, some of my friends, you know, they say they wanted something 4 hours ago and you have 2 hours to finish it. Oh, and by the way, they just gave it to you. Um, so yeah, speed is of the essence. But every once in a while, when you have some time to yourself, uh, don't always rely on those brushes. Try and make those design choices, and then when the time begins to crunch, or when you're in a time crunch for production or whatever, then you use those brushes. But then you can make other decisions because you've made design choices outside of work. So you've kind of done a little bit of studying, and you're basically not at I guess, the mercy of that custom brush. Um, Part of the reason I don't use like a custom leaf brush or a custom tree brush is I can never seem to make it do what I want it to, or make it blend into the environment the way I want it to. So it's not so much a shortcut, but my shortcoming. Your moment of zen. So having kind of gotten something on the other side that I was reasonably happy with, now I'm trying to replicate it on this side. But there's this side of the image, there's a larger value change. There's actually light on this side and shadow. And while there's light and shadow on the other side, the juxtaposition is a lot closer and the contrast is a lot harsher. So I'm trying to figure out the right way to kind of transition between, lit leaves and leaves in shadow, you know, how much fill light actually gets in there. So kind of regretting not making a custom leaf brush at this point. But live and learn. And that's kind of, you know, again, this is like you know, this is kind of a work piece, but it's a personal piece done for instruction. Um, and so I have a lot of time on, I don't have a lingering well, I kind of do have a lingering deadline, but it's not like somebody is knocking on my door saying we want this now. So I can afford to play around with different ways of, I'm not sure how these leaves work. I'm not sure about this transition. So I have time I have the freedom to experiment. And I think that's really important. Going back to what I was talking about earlier is, you know, production is production and you got to do what you got to do to get stuff done. But, try and make some experimentation time, I believe some people call it sandbox time, where you just play around. Um, Try and do studies of films, of painters, and it's a time for you to kind of learn and build up, um, I guess, your vocabulary, your abilities. And so when you go back and you're in the crunch again, um, uh, you can you can bring some of those things that you've learned outside, and that way you keep evolving, you keep progressing as an artist. So more moss, more rocks. little transition because I was painting a lot of little leaves and I realized that that was probably going to drive people nuts. Painting in some hair. This was in the original, and I felt like I was ready to get back to him. I painted out the highlights and stuff, and I'm gonna go back and do that right now. Um, One thing I noticed with some portfolios that I've seen is, when people paint things that basically that dangle, like hair or um, even satchels or some kind of like bag or something that goes over the person's over the person's person. Like they're wearing a backpack or they're wearing something that's kind of pressing against their jacket. One of the biggest things I've noticed is a lack of gravity, a lack of a sense of weight. And so that's what I'm trying to get. I'm trying to, at any point that I can, I'm trying to have this hair bump into other surfaces and then change direction so that there's like a droopiness of the hair coming off the back of his head, going over his turtle shell. Um, and the whole time I'm I'm trying to not make tangents, but also I'm trying to keep things from being repeated. And I'll see it here in a second. Yeah, I just deleted those couple of strands because I was repeating the same spacing. And there it was again. So I'm trying to keep variety in there. And I think um, that's one of the things that, art directors are going to be looking for is that variety. And usually that's, I won't say 9 times out of 10, but maybe 7 times out of 10 when you're looking at a painting and overall it's executed great, but there's just a little something you can't put your finger on it. It's usually um, that there's a repetitiveness, that shapes are similar, that spacing is similar, and that's just something you constantly. It's not something that just becomes innate, at least with me. It's something I have to constantly think about and really avoid. And that's what I'm going to blame the mirroring composition on, is that I was concentrated so much on making things different that I made things the same. So there you go. Also, I like the idea of, wet hair sometimes clumps together, it tangles into itself. So what I did was I painted the hair on its own layer, and now I'm painting the highlight. And this is just like everything else I painted, except this is a brighter value. And I'm painting this on its own layer because I was afraid I was going to screw everything up, and I don't want to start over. Um, so I'm just grabbing kind of the smudge brush, and I for when I want to keep things on their own layer, there's an option to when you're smudging stuff to use all layers or sample all layers, and then you can click that box off to not sample all layers, and it'll only pick up the current layer that you have paint on, digital paint. Um, and so when I'm doing something that I want to keep all in one layer and I want to keep it clean, I'll click that box off. So more of the same. Painting in big representative shapes and then playing with the edges of those shapes. I mean, if you could uh, just break down a lot of my paintings, which is very easy to, um, it's really just kind of uh, shapes with edges, and that's most paintings. Um, I didn't invent that. Some really smart dudes did, and I'm just copying. It is just the arrangement of shapes and the transition between those shapes or the edges. So the edges can be, speckle brush, smudge brush. It could be you could paint everything with a hard brush and just use gradients of color in between. So painting some highlights on the hair. I'm guessing he has it's kind of like viney hair. And I just turned off the hair because I wanted to get. I noticed real quick that I was forgetting about the structure underneath, and felt like I needed to go back in and define that, and then I can throw the hair on top and then be good to go. Um, yeah, clicking that off and on. It kind of has a feeling, at the beginning I was worried that this was going to be a little too much like Gollum, but now he kind of reminds me of that there's a dude in Lord of the Rings. I think his name is Snake or Grima Wormtongue, I think is his name. And yeah, now this guy reminds me of him. So I traded in one Lord of the Rings reference for another. Go figure. So at this point, I'm actually okay with most of this, at least what I've painted. And just kind of painting in, I'm locked the transparency, or maybe I haven't. Well, I locked the transparency of the hair, and I was just painting some fill light, not too much, because it is kind of a graphic element. Um, and now I'm painting in the bounce light. So this is actually just a more complicated version of those spheres that we painted. This is not just spheres, but cylinders. And so again, I throw down some paint and I play with the edge either with another brush or with a eraser or with the smudge, whatever it takes to get the edge that I want. And that's really what it's, yeah, sound like a broken record, but the arrangement of shapes and the transition between those shapes is kind of what I'm going after. So I make like a shape of the reflected light, and in this case, I'm being pretty loose with it. I'll paint like a big shape and then just erase back to kind of get something that I like. Seeing if he would have a little bit of bounce on his chin, but I'm just gonna kind of, I don't know, not gonna put it in. I'm gonna worry about his toes. I just felt like that point, maybe it was a little, I mean, realistically, yeah, light would probably get up there, but I felt like there was so much dark around there that if I added a little bit of light, it might become a point of focus where I want you to look at his eye, which is already a little hard to read. But given that he's a figure, I'm kind of betting on the idea that because it's a figure, you're going to look at his face. That's when we look at people, we don't normally look at their shoes unless we really like shoes. Um, we look at their face. So kind of my whole painting is hinging on that idea. So I felt that it was a little monotonous in the foreground, and I am adding, looking at the reference, and there's like little bits of dirt and mud and then some rocks. And so what I'm gonna do is, and again, I'm figuring this out as I go. I'm gonna make a brush here that's putting color jitter on, and I'm putting foreground background jitter on. Um, and this is gonna be kind of like my dead leaf brush. It it adds just a little bit of like variation to the color, and I'm just painting in some shadows of maybe the dead leaves that are a little layered up on one another, and I'll eventually paint over all of this because I'm kind of looking, and it feels very, very green, especially given my reference. So I'm going to start painting in pretty soon. I'm just going to try and paint in some rocks. And this is going to sound really weird, but I think next to the skull, this is my favorite part of the painting, just because I felt like I caught the color of these rocks, and I think it was kind of like a really desaturated blue, but it feels like a red. And It just feels like those river, like those rocks along the bank of the river. So, and not really getting too fancy with these. And I think that's also the reason I like them is that I'm not worried too much about their representation as far as like the perfect edge. And so I'm just kind of being a little looser with them using the round brush with a taper and opacity set to flow and pen pressure. The opacity set to pen pressure and same thing with the flow. So, so I'm kind of getting, a nice breakup of shapes or a nice breakup within this one shape. So kind of playing with the idea of like a little bit of that rock peeking out, but the magic of undo. This is a lot less layers than a lot of the stuff that I painted on Ralph. And on Ralph, I would try and separate, Wreck-It Ralph, I would try and separate out everything and have one layer for almost every single thing. It was really kind of like a I don't want to say it was like a matte painting because I've done a couple matte paintings for Ralph, but um, it was a very kind of strict thing that I was kind of adhering to, where everything had its own layer, and the edges of everything were very, very crisp. And then I talked to one of my coworkers, and they said that sometimes they paint all on one layer, and they'll keep things on separate layers if they need to, if they know they're going to have to edit it a lot. But having to constantly work back and forth on an image allows you to get I guess a edge quality and a harmonizing of the edges that is kind of hard to get once you start breaking things out onto their own layers. So I have the kappa on his own layer and his hair on his own layer, but really I'm only working on a handful of layers right now. And most of the time when I'm working on like I think I have the midground broken out as one, the kappa broken out as another layer, and then anytime I'm painting detail, I'll add a new layer, but then keep collapsing that to the lower layers. So you guys have seen me paint enough rocks and leaves, so this back area was very kind of loose, so wasn't going to go into that too much, but this was where I actually kind of broke down and said, well, I'm not going to paint every single leaf on these trees. So I went in and took one of my brushes and put some scatter on it and started at this point I was thinking, well, if I have the right colors, or if I have the right colors and I have the right values, then it really shouldn't matter what the edges are. And these, a kind of a circular edge is basically what those leaves are. So I just kind of started going in, and the reason I'm keeping the back a bit looser is because I knew from the beginning, and I thought it would save me time, but I ended up just working just as long. I was going to throw the background out of focus. I was going to use a shallow depth of field to kind of get the feeling that this guy isn't gigantic. Hopefully there's the scale cue of the skull, which, is not terribly smaller than he is, but then, maybe it's a small, uh, like it's a kid's skull. Maybe it's not proportionately correct, but that's my story and I'm sticking to it. So more shapes with this scattered dot brush, and I'll go back in afterwards and pick out pieces to kind of paint a little more into to kind of mass things together. I guess the reason I was so hesitant to use kind of like this speckled brush to do the leaves is because I'm a big fan of resolved shapes, and it just kind of feels ambiguous, but this forest is kind of, those shapes are kind of ambiguous. There's a lot of soft edges in there, at least in this lighting scenario. So yeah, notice I didn't have enough, have all these leaves, but no branches. So adding in some branches and some detail to the rocks. And I'm going to skip ahead here in a second because there's just not a lot going on. And more refining, adding a little bit of, because I do have that separation of layers, I'm going to add in a little bit of atmospheric perspective, excuse me. Some of that mist from the waterfalls. And now that I'm looking at it, there is a lot of mist for such a small waterfall. But whatever. It kind of works. I think I'm going to cut back into, yeah, there I go. And so I've separated the foreground or the middle ground into a couple different layers, and I'm just kind of working back into the water. And again, after this demo, I'll probably go back and refine that, hopping ahead just a little more, because this is really just a whole bunch of just the same. I had a teacher once say, he was an illustrator back in the day before computers and stuff, and he was doing an illustration for a magazine, and they wanted a picture of, I guess, a building, and they wanted to see all the bricks. And he said, in those instances, you just kind of just start painting bricks and put on some music, or start drawing bricks, put on some music, and kind of zone out. Just paint the bricks, or draw the bricks, draw more bricks, draw some more bricks, and you just keep. It's monotonous, but you kind of have to pay attention to it. So you kind of tune out, but at the same time you kind of keep paying attention. So just a little bit of refinement to that front, and this will be the last the last leg of the journey. Kind of, I'm playing with depth of field, so I just added a Gaussian blur to the background, painted in and out on some mask, and here we go. So this is I'm finalizing that blur, and what I did was I duplicated the middle ground, and I'm just adding a mask onto it, and I'm gonna paint out some of the visibility so that I get a little more depth for one layer. And now what I did was I introduced a pin light layer, and I've started doing this more recently because I find that it it mimics what happens to the camera when there's a bright light source and it's reflecting and filling the lens with light. So trying to harmonize the background. So I put a pin light, but then I switched it down to an overlay and a very desaturated, close to medium gray blue. And but I'm realizing, oh, I haven't realized it yet. I just threw on a color dodge layer to kind of get a little bit more punch of that light. And this was me playing with the idea of a lens flare, which I don't use the Photoshop filter. I'll just, it's on the color dodge layer, and then I'll just make a round shape and erase out the center of that shape. I didn't have any reference for a lens flare, but I felt like it was just a little overkill. So, and now everything's kind of come together, but I'm just playing around with stuff. Um, at some point, I'm going to change that pin light layer. I'm going to make it warmer so that it feels like it's coming forward. Just trying some different filters. Film grain adds a little bit of a like a camera feel to it, but I think uh, I think it takes away a little bit. So I duplicated that pin light layer and I turned it orange, and it's a little closer to what I had in my initial color rough. So I'm just checking the values. Sorry, it's sped up 400%, so it's like real quick clicking. And now it's just kind of, this is the last kind of just getting everything to kind of work together. And I think this is the point where I noticed that that I was mirroring the two shapes. I was creating bookends. And I know in some of your guys' homework I had pointed that out, and I do it too. So, and there's I'm just adding in a little bit of the bounce light from across that little stream, little hits of the green light reflecting off of his like his toes and his knuckles. And then this is just a layer added on top where I'm adding like a little bit of integration between him and the ground plane. Some leaves and grass overlapping his toes. And just some last little adjustments, playing around, seeing what I like better. This is actually, I do a lot of this at the end. You know, I'll play with sharpen, blur, maybe double blur. Um, so kind of clicking back and forth. It's not exactly what my thumbnail was, but there it is. So I thought I was done, but I wasn't. Um, I came back and gonna just this is the final image. Just gonna group some of the changes that I made so I can click them on and off for you guys. Um, I mean, this really wasn't too nothing you haven't seen in the demo, so just kind of show you guys real quick, um, and then go over some of the changes that I made. Um, I couldn't let it go. It was bothering me. So aside from some of the post-processing stuff that I did, and I'll go over that in a sec, I'll do this in real time. Um, so this is where I was at when I originally thought I was done, and I just couldn't let it go. So you'll see among some of the changes, I moved this frontal mass of vegetation and rock. So clinical. Um, this mass right here, I didn't like how it was lining up basically with this mass, like they were existing on the same plane. So I moved this one, I just moved it up and kind of back in space. Um, we'll just kind of put that in perspective. So that's the first thing I did. And I also added a little bit more detail in the background. Not that you see it because I eventually blurred it. But the other thing I did was I just kind of took a, just a regular brush, increased the spacing like an ungodly amount. Something, I think it was like all the way up to 1,000%. Yeah, it was something like that. And I just went in and just started putting dots in and erasing out dots so that we get kind of like those gnats and like the pollen in the air. And it's just another scale cue, at least in my opinion. Kind of lets you know that you're kind of focused on something a little smaller. If you can see small stuff clearly, then you must be somewhat small. So hopefully it adds a sense of um, kind of shrinking or a sense of smallness, that this guy isn't a huge monster, that, with the with the leaves and the rocks and the size of the skull. Hopefully I've put enough um, scale cues in here that say that this thing isn't, 50 stories tall. Maybe the size of a man, probably smaller. Um, and so now to go into the post-processing stuff. So after an image, if the reason I did this on this image was I like to do it at the end of an image that I'm reasonably happy with before any kind of post-processing. Um, and I feel like if I'm not entirely happy with an image and I start slapping filters on, I'm trying to cover something up and that just gnaws at me. So I'd rather not try and spiff it up with filters and kind of if I don't have any more time to work on it, I just leave it. Or if I do have time to work on it, I fix it to the point where I'm happy, and then I can, if I like the painting, then the filters are just gonna add to it. If I don't like the painting, and well, it's just gonna be a polished, crappy piece, and I don't want that. I don't want like a fancy piece that's not good. Rather have a good piece that's not fancy. So the first thing I did was this is kind of hard to see, but it helps a little in my opinion. I just added a sharpen, which is under filter. Oh, grab the right layer. If you go under filter, sharpen, and it's the first one. Sometimes I go to unsharp mask, but I don't want to have to mess with a lot of settings. Um, and so the second thing I did was I like that effect, but I wanted a little bit of a more dreamlike quality. So what I did was I just duplicated this layer, and I have that layer, and then I'm gonna do this in reverse actually. I'm gonna blur this entire image so you can see what happens. So now you see it's kind of blurry, and this is something I kind of stumbled onto. So now that you have this blurred version of your whole image, if you go to Layer Modes, Lighten, what this does is it acts as like the lights are blown out, and so you get kind of a fuzzy edge along everything that's light, and the darker stuff, not so much. So it gets a nice effect around this light area, especially on his shell and his arm. Now, obviously, we don't want it everywhere, so what I did was I added a mask and I painted out several areas. So I'll click off and on, and most noticeably, it's around the skull. I painted it out and around his face because I want it clear in a couple of key spots and blurry in others. Actually, I should probably reverse that. I want it blurry in a couple of key spots and not really affecting everything else. But it has a nice quality. I think they call it bloom when it comes into photography, and I know they try and implement it in games because it kind of simulates what happens, the visual phenomena of seeing bright things. So that's yet another trick. And lastly, just to kind of make it feel like it's being shot on film, I added a slight film grain. This is something that's way too easily overused, and all of a sudden you'll see everybody and it looks like they rubbed their artwork on sandpaper. So I advise extreme caution with this. This is actually kind of bugging me a little. You can tone it down. I just wanted like a nice little grain in there to kind of tie everything together, and it does its job. And the other thing that this does is I'll zoom out. So this is at 100% opacity, and you'll see a couple just slight value changes happening, and that's just it's kind of treating the image like it's exposing for the camera. So yet another kind of camera-esque trick. And I'm okay with this. Before I was kind of just, oh my gosh, people are gonna just hate this painting. So I wanted to go back and kind of address some of the things that were really bothering me. And this isn't to say by any means that this is, couldn't be improved anymore, but I think I'm okay with this for right now. So, but give me a week and I'll probably hate it. But for right now, I'm happy, and that's kind of what counts. So there you go. That's the behind the scenes of the secret installment, I guess. So your assignment, this last assignment, is to basically finalize your the one of the paintings that you worked on in thumbnail form and kind of just bring it to a finish, using every trick in the book, or at least every trick that you've learned in this class and more if you've learned stuff outside. So um, studies, it says studies should be no larger than 1,000 pixels on the longest side. That's what I want you to submit it at. If you want to work larger, I think I worked at 3,000 pixels on the longest side. If you want to work larger, that's completely fine. I mean, if this is something you'll probably want to put in your portfolio, um, or hopefully you'd want to put in your portfolio. But when you submit it, just down res, save a JPEG version out at 1,000 pixels on the